Hello, readers by eyes and ears. This is Mighty Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are continuing the reading of Thousand Autumns, Volume 3, also known as Qianqiu by Meng Xi Shi. We're reading chapters 80 through 82 today, and you guys, we are pretty much in the final stretch, okay? We've got, 6 chapters left, and 3 of them are being covered in this video. So one more video and then we'll be on to the second to last book. So without further ado, enjoy. Chapter 80, Breakthrough. After Yan Wushi had left, Shen Qiao urgently tried to break through his sealed acupoints. He was worried about what tortures Yan Wushi would suffer if he fell into Sang Jingxing's hands with his current martial prowess. The true qi in his meridian surged without restraint, almost trying to burst out of his body. He could feel his heart alternating between blazing hot, like it was being broiled, and freezing cold, like it had fallen into an icy cavern. His entire person was dazed and muddled, numb even to the flow of time outside. It was as if he'd fallen into a dreamlike state, but one that was still grounded in reality. On one hand, his body was being tormented by the alternating heat and cold. On the other hand, his consciousness seemed to be wandering about outside. It was as though his soul wished to tear itself away from his body, but a single thread tethered it firmly to his mortal shell, forcing it to rampage along with his disordered true qi. His chest throbbed dully from the disturbance, his forelimbs were entirely numb, and he wanted to vomit. The first half of Shen Qiao's life had been smooth sailing. Xuandu Mountain had been like a barrier, sealing its inhabitants off from all the treacheries of the outside world. Both him and everyone else on Xuandu Mountain, including the greatly ambitious Yu Ai, had already partially detached from the secular world. Their views on people and their worldly matters all inevitably carried a trace of naivety and presumptuousness, that this was how things should be. However, because there'd been Xuandu Mountain and Qi Fengge standing at the forefront, acting as their shield, none of them had realized what the world below the mountain was like. After that, Banbu Peak seemed to have split Shen Qiao's life into two clear halves. The peacefulness of the first half juxtaposed against the turbulence of what came after. He'd experienced many fates worse than death, and he'd witnessed both the kindness and evil within the human hearts in the world. But ultimately, no trace of rage or hatred remained in his heart, and even if there had, the deaths of the abbot in Chuyi, gaining his own disciple in Shiwu, his shared advance and retreat together with Bixia sect, Yan Wushi's act of luring away Sang Jingxing, even bidding farewell to him in that manner. With all those events, any anger or hatred would have dissipated like smoke, leaving no trace behind. This thought was like a drop of ice water. Slowly, it fanned out from his forehead and through his entire self. At that moment, his consciousness seemed to completely escape his mortal shell, escaped the Buddha statue sheltering him, fled the little temple, and arrived in an unknown world, vast and indescribable. All his pains gradually left his body, and soon he felt them no longer. However, a sudden flash of understanding bloomed and opened before his eyes, and it was like the moon and sun suspended high in the sky, illuminating the mountains and oceans below, while fish leapt along the waves and the rain reflected the starry heavens above. His sealed acupoints slowly opened, the true qi flowing through his body like warm streams, slowly allowing his numb, aching limbs to regain their strength. Shen Qiao felt as though he'd been transformed into a little fish. With a swish of his tail, he leapt into the boundless universe and its star-filled skies. Above his head came the steady noise of dripping. Unable to withstand the weight of the dew droplets, the leaf stalks bent, and the dew, eager to be free of the leaves, slid off and fell before melting into the deep pond and shattering its tranquility. He raised his head, watching the outside world through the transparent, rippling pond water. It was a profound and mysterious feeling, one that could be experienced but not described. That droplet of dew fell into the pond, but it seemed more like it fallen inside his heart, and the entire world shifted with it. Suddenly, harsh winter transformed into balmy spring, and the waters flowing around him too grew warm. In his vicinity, countless similar little fishes darted past him, shaking their heads and swishing their tails as they merrily swam forward. The stars and moon were strewn over the pond surface, and they sent their lustrous brilliance into the waters below, causing everything around them to glisten and glow as if this were the Milky Way. Shunshao closed his eyes. He felt like he'd already gone through the entire lifespan of a fish, and now he'd been reborn as this pond, so deep and vast. Day after day, he waited for the rain to fill him to the brim, waited for the pondside flowers to bloom and whisper to him their troubles, then waited for the blooms to fall and enter themselves within the water. For spring to shape the clouds, then for autumn to bring the rains, for the clear bell to ring from afar, for the trees to fill with blooming peach blossoms. He suddenly recalled a line from the Juyang strategy. Outside of the self, there is no other. Shunshao still remembered the first time he'd seen this line, back when Shutsuan had given him the Juyang strategy scroll. Although he'd used the Juyang strategy's true qi to rebuild his meridians with his rebirth, after fighting his way out of certain death, he still hadn't fully comprehended every line within the Juyang strategy. At that time, there'd been another line before this one. When the self enters the heart of the other, one will be free of all hindrances. This line was much easier to understand. Bluntly speaking, studying the sword required fathoming the sword's heart, and studying the saber required fathoming the saber's heart. When facing an enemy, you must know both yourself and the enemy. Only then could you be invincible in battle. But in this way, the other and the self would become one. Then why separate them out again and say, outside the self, there is no other? Once, Shunshao had thought that it must be an error, or that Tao Hongjing hadn't thought it through even when writing it. However, at this very moment, he suddenly understood the meaning of this line. It was like he'd fallen into a rut with his previous thinking, misleading him. Humans exist in the space between heaven and earth. First comes the self, and only after can there be an other. Humans judge both other people and other things through the self. So if the self has no joy, then heaven and earth have no joy. If the self has no sorrow, then heaven and earth have no sorrow. When the self's heart is full of cheer, even plain words will give birth to spring. When the self's heart is full of grief, even the mountains and rivers will fade away. With this realization, not only did Shunchao's mind immediately open up, even his body seemed to expand without limit, as if it could now hold a boundless, infinite amount of true qi, like the sea that embraced hundreds of rivers, magnanimous and forgiving. His meridians dilated from the true qi, and with this dilation, his true qi was now free and unfettered, the worries of congestion or blockages cast away. Shanhe Tongbei quivered slightly, as if it sensed its master's mind and progress. Too excited to compose itself, it seemed ready to leave its sheath and sweep through its enemies. But at this time, the 4 people outside the Buddha statue had just entered the small temple. Yan Shou said coldly, "Search everything." Because Xiao Se had been wounded, his steps were heavy, his gait somewhat slow. Bai Rong didn't seem interested in diving into the task either, though, despite being unharmed, she only followed behind Xiao Se. The 2 of them circled around the back of the temple once. Xiao Se returned and said, "Elder Yan, there are no tracks of Shunchao. Could he have seen our great numbers and abandoned Yan Wushi to leave first?" "That's impossible," said Yan Shou. "He was already exhausted after fighting us. To recover in such a short amount of time is beyond difficult. If he did run, he couldn't have gone far. Since he didn't leave with Yan Wushi, he must have found somewhere to hide first, and this place is quite suitable. Have you already searched everything?" "We have," said Xiao Se. "This temple is very small, and there's only a single room at the back, without anywhere to hide. The well is still functional. There's water at the bottom, so he can't hide there either. Furthermore, there are no mechanisms that lead to secret rooms or underground passages." He shot a glance at Bai Zhong. But Bai Shimei has shown much mercy to Shen Chao, it seems. She's always hindering us and urging us to keep going. I wonder what her intentions are. Xiao Shishong really spends every moment bad-mouthing me, Bai Rong said sweetly. Do you think that Shitsun will start favoring you if you get rid of me? Don't forget that you belong under sect leader Yuan. If you wish to switch factions, you need to display your sincerity. What's the point of picking on a little girl like me? Suddenly, Bao Yuan spoke up from where he was standing next to Yan Shou. You haven't even found him, and you're already fighting amongst yourselves. Is this what sect leader Yuan and Elder Song teach their disciples? His tone was dark and sinister, completely incongruent with a monk's solemn, dignified appearance. But it was evidently quite effective. Both Baizhong and Xiaoce closed their mouths and said no more. Yan Shou looked all around him before his gaze finally fell on that giant Buddha statue. He paused for a moment, then walked toward it. His movements drew everyone else's attention. Even Bao Yuan made a sound of surprise. This statue is incredibly large. If it's hollow in the center, it could conceal someone. Yan Shou surveyed the statue from top to bottom, starting from the top of its head down to its stone platform. Then he suddenly pulled away the fabric upon that platform, and his gaze landed on the marks left under the draping. With a cold laugh, he sent a palm strike at the statue. The force from his blow struck the statue right in the center. Cracks snaked up the statue with lightning speed, then split open with a rumble. There was indeed someone inside. Everyone could see the silhouette of the person concealed within the statue. Yan Shou burst out laughing, then leapt into the air. Like an eagle swooping down on its prey, he immediately pounced at Shen Chao. His palm blast rolled to his target before him, quick as a raging tempest, filling the skies with a blood shadow and pelting down with bone-piercing cold. It left no time to guard. Anyone trying to defend against it would only feel their entire body being engulfed by the blood shadow of his palm blast, without the slightest gap or even the chance to escape. It left one trembling in fear, hearts overtaken by despair. Shen Chao was already exhausted after fighting 1-on-4, but even if some of his strength still remained, Yan Shou's all-encompassing palm strike would be certain to catch him unprepared. Previously, during their battle, Yan Shou had been fearful of Shen Chao's echelon of sword heart, but he'd also probed out Shen Chao's true condition and realized that his internal energy was completely insufficient to sustain that echelon. In short, he'd advanced too quickly in swordplay, and his foundations of internal energy couldn't catch up. It was impossible for this fatal drawback to have changed within such a short period of time. Therefore, he'd believed that even if he couldn't seriously injure him, this strike would be enough to firmly hold Shen Chao in place, forcing him to take the defensive. While this thought flashed through his mind, his palm blast had already slammed into Shen Chao. Yan Shou and Shen Chao were only a short distance away from each other, and his opponent didn't have time to turn around and defend himself. Then, a white light suddenly swelled before him as murderous intent, sinister and cold, rushed at him head on. It actually suppressed Yan Shou's palm blast, and the sword chi even overwhelmed the blood shadow to press on toward Yan Shou's face. "Careful, Elder Yan!" Xiaoce yelled. Yan Shou didn't need his shout at all. He'd already rushed to retreat. The others didn't stand by and watch either. Bao Yuan leapt into the air and grabbed at Shen Chao from a different direction. Shen Chao swung his sword horizontally, and sword chi burst out along the blade. As his true chi swept forth, his blue robes fluttered, and he transformed into a blue arc which interphased with the sword glare, shining. It left the eyes dazzled and confused, unable to distinguish what was what. Yan Shou's face flickered between expressions, and his one retreat took him back 10 steps, pressing his back to the temple wall, leaving him no room to retreat further. He'd managed to make it out. Shen Chao was clearly rushing toward him while leaving Bao Yuan aside. The man had used his sword chi to weave a sword screen, which directly walled off everyone else's attacks, allowing him to focus his entire attention on Yan Shou. But Shen Chao had clearly exhausted all his strength before. How had he recovered so much in such a short period of time? Yan Shou didn't have time for careful thought. He soared straight into the air, smashing through the roof tiles with a palm strike as Shen Chao followed in close pursuit. The two of them fought from outside the temple to up on the roof. Their silhouettes drifted about like wraiths, wrapped in sword glares and palm blasts, harsh as the roiling tempest or the cold of the dead of winter, when the trees and grasses withered and all things fell silent. The moment Yan Shou's palm of blood struck forth, bloody rains accompanied it, cold and gloomy, with wave upon wave of murderous intent. However, the sword glare suddenly rose, as brilliant as the red gold clouds of dusk, spraying forth like spring waters splashing upon rocks. It emptied a flood of divine light, and all faded before its radiance. In contrast, even the bright moon seemed to have lost some color, and it ducked shyly behind the clouds, never to reappear. In all of heaven and earth, only the sword glare existed. The mountains and rivers grieved in tandem as metal and stone released their wail. Oh my God, this is beautiful. Xiao Se found that he couldn't intervene, and he didn't force himself. Instead, he stood by and watched. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that Bai Zhong was also completely still. Does Bai Shimei still hold lingering feelings for Shen Chao, to the point that she can't even bear to personally fight him herself? He couldn't help but say coldly. Bai Zhong was all smiles. Even the combined efforts of elders Yan and Bao Jun can't bring him down. If I attacked as well, I'd just be adding to the confusion. If Xiao Shishong is capable, your little sister is perfectly happy to hold the line for you. These weren't empty words. Shen Chao was holding his own, even fighting 1 against 2. Not only was Bao Jun helpless against him, even Yan Shou was betraying signs of impending defeat. How could a single person grow so strong? Xiao Se was bewildered and confused. He even suspected that Yan Wushi must have copied He Huan sect's pear cultivation techniques. But even if they had pear cultivated, they couldn't have finished in such a short amount of time. He gave a cold huff, completely uninterested in squabbling with Bai Zhong. Instead, he glanced up at the battle on the roof. In the time they'd spoken these short words, however, it was already clear which of the two would be the victor and who would be defeated. Chapter 81. The Emperor's Funeral. The hearts of the members of He Huan sect weren't unified, and the clues were obvious from Shen Chao and Yan Shou's battle. Shen Chao had just forced open his acupoints, but it wasn't possible for his martial strength to suddenly improve by leaps and bounds to the point of reaching the pinnacle in one day. At best, he'd only been able to dilate his meridians and recover some strength. With his original level of strength, he and Yan Shou should have been evenly matched. But facing both Yan Shou and Bao Jun together was much more strenuous. However, when Bao Jun saw Shen Chao focused on dealing with Yan Shou, he gradually stopped interfering. He let Shen Chao hold the upper hand while Yan Shou was pushed to the end of his tether. Yan Shou's heart secretly filled with hatred. Even more, he didn't want to be looked down upon. He used all his strength, vowing that he'd kill Shen Chao beneath his palm. But who could have expected that the current Shen Chao would be so different from the past one? His Shanhe Tong Bei was enough to prevent anyone from approaching him. More than once, Yan Shou wanted to change from defense to offense, but his fear of Shen Chao's sword screen forced him to shift back to defense. Among the dense sword glares, the once mighty and awe-inspiring Buddha with the blood-stained hand was actually being suppressed to the point he couldn't release a single strike. His eyebrows were tightly furrowed on his frosty face and sweat beaded on his forehead. When forced into a difficult situation, one would inevitably reveal some openings. And right at this time, Shanhe Tongbei's sword glare flooded forth, sweeping right toward the center of Yan Shou's forehead. Of course, Bao Jun couldn't just sit and watch Yan Shou lose his life in front of him. Else, he'd have a hard time explaining himself once he returned to He Huan sect. He yelled at Xiao Se and Bai Zhong, "Why are you just watching?" At the same time, he raised the palm to strike at Shen Qiao. Xiao Se and Bai Zhong couldn't continue watching from the sidelines. They immediately entered the circle of battle and attacked Shen Qiao one after the other. However, when martial experts battle, anything can happen in an instant. The moment they attacked, they heard Yanshou scream miserably, and blood sprayed from amid the sword screen before splattering to the ground once the sword glare faded. An arm tumbled from the roof onto the ground. Everyone stared at it. Yanshou had lost his arm. He stumbled backward, almost falling from the roof, his face contorted in hideous agony as he sealed an acupoint to stem the blood flow. Naturally, he could no longer continue the fight. Bao Jun exchanged several blows with Shen Qiao, then realized with a shock that Shen Qiao hadn't exhausted his strength even after his battle with Yanshou. His sword chi remained abundant, continuous, and unending. Bao Jun considered the pros and cons, then decided that even if he could win this match, it'd be a costly win. Moreover, he didn't hold any deep-seated grudges toward Shen Qiao, and killing him wouldn't benefit him much either. So he only used around half of his strength to prevent Shen Qiao from killing Yanshou, and they fought each other for a while. Until Xiao Se shouted from his end, "Elder Bao Yun, Elder Yan isn't looking good." Aside from losing his arm, Yanshou's body was riddled with injuries, both large and small, internal and external. He'd lost far too much blood. Even though he'd sealed his acupoint to try to stem the bleeding, even redirecting his chi and regulating his breaths, he was still unable to slow the blood loss enough. Even more fatal was that in Yanshou's moniker of the Buddha with the blood-stained hand, the blood-stained hand referred to his now severed right one. Without his right arm, even if he could keep his life, his martial prowess would plummet. To a martial arts practitioner, this was the most fatal of blows. On top of his loathing for Shen Qiao, he also hated Bao Jun and the rest for just standing by and watching. Under the weight of his combined rage and panic, he simply passed out. Hearing Xiao Se's words, Bao Jun took the chance to withdraw. "Shen Qiao, you now owe us a debt for injuring an elder of our He Huan sect. He Huan sect will definitely do everything in our power to collect on it." "There's no time like the present," said Shen Qiao coolly. "Why choose another day when we can settle the accounts now?" Upon saying this, he swept toward Yanshou with his sword. He wanted to kill him while the man was helpless to defend himself. Bao Jun was stunned. He hadn't expected this level of persistence from Shen Qiao. He immediately chased after him, sending a palm strike in his direction. Bai Zhong had flown over as well, and she shaped her slender hands into blue lotus blossoms, her demeanor exquisite and charming, almost too lovely to take in. However, Shen Qiao swung his sword horizontally, and his sword screen suddenly shifted through a myriad of transformations. It dissolved Bao Jun and Bai Zhong's attack, and even knocked Bai Zhong's palm strike off course to hit Bao Jun. Bao Jun yelled angrily, "Bai Zhong!" "Oh no," Bai Zhong said sweetly. "Elder Bao Jun, please forgive me. It was this hateful scoundrel's fault." Her steps were as graceful as a swaying lotus, her sleeves like their flourishing blossoms. Phantoms emerged one after another, growing densely around Shen Qiao as they blossomed forth. It was a gorgeous scene, but a glance was enough for those in the know to realize that this dense field of lotuses was actually a dense field of true qi. This was what made the blue lotus seals so formidable. If the user possessed great martial strength, each lotus would contain a terrifying amount of true qi, their attacks surging like the tide, unceasing and endless as the waves in the back drove the ones in the front, each more powerful than the last. Bai Zhong's blue lotus seals looked powerful beyond compare, but Shen Qiao, within touching distance, could sense that the true qi within her every strike held not even half of the internal energy she'd used the first time he'd seen this technique. Bao Jun had no plans to fight Shen Qiao any longer. While Bai Zhong and Xiao Se were hampering their opponent, he picked up the unconscious Yanshou and made to leave. From a great distance off came his final words, "He Huan sect will seek your guidance another day." Being injured, Xiao Se had never had the desire to fight in the first place. When he saw Bao Jun leave, he wanted to leave as well, but Shen Chao had already turned his attention to him, and Shan He Tongbei followed right after. Another slash carved itself into his back, and fresh blood gurgled forth, dyeing his clothes red. With a cry of pain, he pushed his qinggong to its utmost without looking back. In the blink of an eye, he'd already melded into the boundless night, and his silhouette vanished completely. Shen Chao wanted to pursue him, but Bai Zhong obstructed him, and he was unable to disengage. They were on completely different sides, and she'd taken no small number of lives, but she'd shown mercy to Shen Chao 2 or 3 times, especially back at Bailong Monastery. If she hadn't impeded Xiao Si then, perhaps Shen Chao and Shi Wu could never have escaped and survived. As such, Shen Chao refused to consider her fondness for him, but he couldn't be too cold to her either. Right now, Bai Zhong was stalling him, preventing him from pursuing Bao Juan and the others, but he couldn't attack her seriously. He inevitably grew sullen and frustrated. Seeing his expression, Bai Zhong burst into giggles, then ceased her attacks. Shen Chao saw that she'd suddenly come to a standstill, and he also withdrew his sword and pulled back. Since we parted beneath Bixia's sect, this one has been tossing and turning in bed every night, yearning to see you again, said Bai Zhong, beaming. Today I see that Shenlong's martial arts have greatly improved, enough that no one can push you around ever again. Only then was I comforted. But even though I'm this infatuated with you, and I've shown you mercy and support time and again, you're so rough and violent whenever you see me. How heartless of you! There wasn't even a hint of sorrow or surprise in her expression, so it was difficult to tell how genuine her words were. Shen Chao said earnestly, I shall always keep your kindness in my mind. I will never forget it. Bai Zhong covered her mouth as she laughed. I was just saying it because I could, yet you actually took it so seriously. Still, you're so good looking no matter what you do. Even I can't help but wish for more intimacy with you. She made to come forward, startling Shen Chao. He took 3 large steps back, but Bai Zhong stopped in her tracks and giggled. Shen Chao only felt that her thoughts were as impossible to read as Yan Wushi's. Truly, they proved themselves to be from the same demonic discipline. They certainly had some things in common. Do you know where Yan Wushi is luring Sang Jingxing? He asked. Bai Zhong nodded. I do. They were heading toward the foot of the mountain. If my guess is correct, Yan Wushi most likely wants to use the city walls as cover to shake off Sang Jingxing. Shen Chao was anxious to chase after them. He turned right around to leave, but Bai Zhong wouldn't let him go. We haven't seen each other in so long. Is this the kind of attitude you should show your savior? Thank you for the information, said Shen Chao. If there's anything else, let's leave it for another day. Shen Chao! When he heard her yell out his full name, he halted his steps and looked back. Bai Zhong's smile had already left her face, and complicated emotions lurked in her lovely, peach blossom-shaped eyes as she gazed straight at him. I haven't thanked you yet, she said. In He Huan sect, Yan Shou has never liked me. Now that you've injured him gravely, I'll have one less powerful enemy within the sect. However, Shenlong, in the end, I'm still a member of He Huan sect. Next time we meet, if you continue to oppose He Huan sect, I can no longer show you any mercy. Shen Chao was silent for a moment. You wish to become the leader of He Huan sect? Bai Zhong was a bit taken aback, but she immediately returned to being sweet. And I thought Shenlong was completely indifferent to me. I didn't expect you'd guess this. Shen Chao sighed, thinking of the unceasing internal strife within He Huan sect, of how their members were all cruel and heartless. There were many things he wanted to say to dissuade her, but in the end he held his tongue. He only cupped his hands at her instead. I wish you all the best and hope that you take care of yourself. May we meet again. Bai Zhong watched his retreating figure in the distance, then stuck out her tongue. Foolish Shenlong. As he ran, Shen Chao executed his qinggong to the utmost, his body flying ahead. But even after spending over half the night in pursuit, he still saw no trace of Yan Wushi or Sang Jingxing. Logically speaking, Yan Wushi's martial arts had yet to recover, so Sang Jingxing must have been able to catch up to him after giving chase for so long. Even if the two of them had run as they fought, it was impossible that Shen Chao still hadn't caught up to them after over half a night with the speed of his qinggong. By now, Shun Xiao had realized that Bai Zhong had probably tricked him. She'd pointed him in completely the wrong direction, deliberately making him waste his efforts. But even if he returned to that small temple, now to seek payback, Bai Zhong would not be there. Shun Xiao stopped, panting slightly. He lowered his head to look at Shan Hetong Bei in his hand, then looked up and gazed into the distance. After wasting over half the night, with no idea where to go, what hope did he have of finding a single person? Shun Xiao remembered the words Yan Wushi had spoken before he'd left. He closed his eyes and forcibly suppressed his churning emotions. As if it could sense its master's complicated, ineffable feelings, Shan Hetong Bei began to rattle in its sheath. Dawn arrived as a trace of milky white creeping over the vast and boundless horizon, as if eager to break free of the abyss in order to bring light to all the world. One word silently surfaced within Shun Xiao's heart. Chang'an. The northward journey to Chang'an wasn't a long one. Shun Xiao's pace was fairly brisk, but because he didn't travel both day and night, it still took him several days. As he neared Chang'an, Shun Xiao had already sensed that something was amiss. From time to time, on the official roads leading into the capital, he'd find exiled families of guilty officials heading away from the city. There were also some conscripted laborers and convicts being sent to Chang'an on the orders of the government officials. He'd seen such things in the past as well, but they hadn't been common. To see two waves of this on the same day was definitely out of the ordinary. While resting at the tea pavilion, Shun Xiao saw a family whose hands and feet were shackled. Led by soldiers on horseback, they stumbled along, looking rather wretched. The soldiers escorting them wanted to rest, so the group stopped to take a seat at the tea pavilion. But no such treatment was afforded to the exiled family. They remained sitting outside the tea pavilion without even a drink of water. Shun Xiao whispered a few words to the pavilion's waiter, then walked to the table where the soldiers were sitting. Meetings are ordained by fate. This humble Taoist wishes to treat the two gentlemen to a cup of water. Would the two be willing to accept this favor? At this time, Shun Xiao had already changed back into the fluttering fabric of his Taoist robes. Even without speaking, he resembled an eminent master of great enlightenment, and when he did, his voice was gentle and pleasant, giving him an aura that drew people in. Yuan Yong had prevented both Buddhism and Taoism, but the common folks' high regard for both schools had never been extinguished. Furthermore, a glance at Shun Xiao was enough to tell that he wasn't an ordinary Taoist at all. The two soldiers didn't dare put on airs, but immediately rose to return the greeting. How could we let this Taoist master treat us? How about he sit down, and we can chat instead? This had been Shun Xiao's intention in the first place. He took the opportunity to say, "This humble Taoist vowed before the venerable immortals to earn 99 merits within 3 years, and at this time he lacks only 1. Would the two gentlemen help me accomplish this by letting him offer some tea to people outside as well, so that they may quench their thirst?" Their soldiers smiled. "This Taoist master is so compassionate. Please, go ahead." Shun Xiao asked the waiter to send the tea over, and the criminal family was of course moved to tears. Then he took the opportunity to ask, "On this humble Taoist's return to the capital, he has seen many families of guilty officials being exiled. Has something significant happened within the city, or did those officials offend His Majesty?" "Oh," said the soldier, "they've indeed offended His Majesty. His Majesty wanted to renovate the imperial palace. The fathers, brothers, or husbands of these people were court officials who came up to raise their objections. They infuriated His Majesty and brought this disaster upon themselves." Shun Xiao was confused. Renovate the palace? From what this humble Taoist knows, His Majesty is hardworking and frugal, as well as very strict on himself. He doesn't seem like one who'd indulge in comfort and pleasure. But the soldier replied nervously, "I must offer you some advice, Taoist master. You must not say these words after entering the city. The previous emperor was indeed frugal and compassionate toward the people, but the current emperor is different. His Majesty did not even observe his father's death for a month, and he forbade the people as well. There's even less to be said about the ones who raised their objections." Hearing these words, Shun Xiao's expression fell completely, his heart thumping in his chest. Yuan Yong had died? Chapter 82. The New Emperor. The soldier saw the great change in Shun Chao's expression, but took it as him being unable to accept the truth so quickly. He consoled him. The previous emperor never liked Buddhism or Taoism, but now His Majesty has ascended to the throne. The restrictions on Buddhism and Taoism have been relaxed. He's even redesignated Buddhism as the state religion. You'll be able to walk about freely in Chang'an, Taoist master. You no longer need to worry about being interrogated. Shun Chao gave a wry smile. Was this what they meant by every cloud has a silver lining? Then why wasn't His Majesty willing to observe his father's death? The moment he asked this, the two soldiers immediately grew nervous. They glanced around them, checking that no one was paying attention, then whispered, "How could we know something like that? It's better not to ask too much about it, Taoist master." Shun Chao asked further, "Then do you know what's happening with the Prince of Qi, Yuan Xian?" Both soldiers shook their head, indicating that they didn't. As soldiers, they were on the bottom rung. The Prince of Qi's whereabouts indeed wasn't something they should be concerned with. Since that was the case, there wasn't much Shun Chao could ask. He thanked the two men and finished his tea. On seeing them prepare to resume their journey with the family of the guilty, he bid them farewell. He then loosened the reins he tied to a nearby fence and vaulted onto his horse before riding in the direction of Chang'an. Shun Chao didn't notice too much change upon entering Chang'an. It was still as hectic and bustling as ever, with people coming to and fro in endless streams. Compared to the other provincial capitals he'd visited, it was many times more prosperous. The only difference was that there were more government officials on the streets, especially on the main roads to the imperial city. Some were patrolling, others were escorting criminals. There were both male and female criminals, young and old, just as Shun Chao had seen outside the city. Fearful worry was written all over their faces, making them seem somewhat incongruent within the lively city. Shun Chao stopped to watch them for a while. There were children in the group, and he found their crying and wailing hard to take. But he knew very well that even if he did rescue them, even if the family had been wrongly accused, he'd have no place to relocate them. In the end, it might cause them to suffer even more. On top of that, in the future, there'd probably be even more people who'd end up in similar situations. Saving one family was easy. Saving all the people in this world was hard. He sighed to himself and averted his gaze, then turned and left. He first went to the junior preceptor's residence, Yan Wushi's original residence in the capital. He didn't approach the building, only gazed at it from afar. Unsurprisingly, the manor had already been sealed off. The gates were locked, the yard before the main building deserted. Land in the capital was enormously expensive, and this was the only area that even the carriages avoided, as though everyone were afraid that they'd be implicated in a crime and so kept their distance. Though there were a couple of vegetable sellers nearby with people purchasing from them, a close look at their expressions was enough to tell that something was off. They didn't seem like normal vendors, but more like they were purposely loitering in the area. In the past, Shun Chao wouldn't have thought twice about approaching these people and asking questions, but now, having spent enough time with Yan Wushi, he'd been subconsciously influenced. He also knew it best to observe all the minutiae. At this time, he'd sensed that something was amiss, so he didn't approach them further. Danmei had two houses in the capital. One was the official mansion gifted by Yuan Yong, similar to the junior preceptor's residence, while the second was a private manor few people knew about, though it still wasn't a secret. Last time Shun Chao had been in Chang'an, Danmei had misunderstood his relationship with Yan Wushi and personally showed him the place, then warmly welcomed Shun Chao inside as a guest. Shun Chao hadn't known whether to laugh or to cry. The official mansion was like the junior preceptor's residence. It'd been sealed off, and there were people in disguise around it, secretly monitoring the area. However, the private residence was still there, and though the gates were shut, they weren't locked. The private manor of Danmei's was located in the depths of an alley in the west of the city. Those living nearby were mostly gentry scholars with modest family properties. Lacking the endless streams of senior officials' carriages or the din of a merchant marketplace, it made for an excellent hiding place. Shunqiao didn't open the gates. Instead, he vaulted over the wall. With his martial arts, even this leap was made soundlessly, his pose confident and graceful. The manor was rather tidy and clean, the plants neatly arranged. There wasn't a speck of dust anywhere, but it was cold and deserted, without a trace of life. Shunqiao walked around the interior once, pushing open every door and entering each building, but found nothing. Where had Danmei gone? In recent years, Huanyue sect's influence had been coupled with the regime of northern Zhou. Yuan Yong had granted them a lofty position and relied on them like his left and right limbs. Chang'an was equivalent to Huanyue sect's main headquarters, but of the three demonic sects, Huanyue sect was a bit special. Yan Wushi had only accepted 2 disciples, Danmei and Yu Shengyan, while the rest of their forces were scattered throughout different locations, giving the impression that they were lacking in manpower. Now that everyone had left the capital, hunting for them was like searching for a needle within the ocean. A small sound suddenly came from the eastern wing. It was very faint and sounded like someone had accidentally bumped into a table. And it just happened to come from the last building that Shunqiao had yet to investigate. The person in the house seemed to be suppressing their breathing as much as possible, but with Shunqiao's ears, he could still hear them clearly. He pushed the door open and slowly walked toward the folding screen. The sound of stifled breathing grew heavier and heavier. Shunqiao stopped in front of the bed, then bent down and reached out. A surprised shout came from beneath the bed. Before Shunqiao could touch the other person, a small figure had already scampered out, running toward the door. But she hadn't gotten very far when she suddenly halted in place, and even her mute acupoint had been tapped, leaving her unable to make a sound. She could only show an expression of great terror. "Don't be afraid," she heard someone say. "I came here in search of an old friend, but I didn't expect my old friend's entire family to have moved away." The handsome, almost otherworldly Taoist explained gently as he circled to stand in front of her. "That's why I entered to take a look. Who are you?" Someone like this didn't seem like a bad person, no matter how she looked at it. Her heartbeat slowly calmed down. Shunqiao unsealed her mute acupoint. The girl was quite young, and the dust all over her face failed to conceal the fair skin beneath. Judging by her clothing, she should be from a wealthy aristocratic family, a child who'd been pampered from birth. He had no idea why she'd run here. "Who are you?" The girl gathered her courage to ask back. Shunqiao smiled. "My name is Shunqiao. I'm a Taoist priest from Xuandu Mountain." "Shunqiao." The girl seemed to be pondering it. "Shun as in elm salp from the Books of Rites? And Qiao as in Mount Yuanqiao from Leizi, Questions of Tang?" Yes, precisely those 2 characters. Shunqiao marveled at this girl's depth of knowledge at so young an age. "And which family are you from? Why are you hiding here?" Ultimately, the girl was still small. Regardless of how mature she seemed, she couldn't maintain the image for too long. When she heard his words, her face washed over with relief. "I've heard Uncle mention Taoist Master Shun before. Taoist Master Shun wasn't ordered to find me, was he?" Shunqiao was left a bit confused by her digression. "Who's your uncle? And who would have ordered me?" "I'm Ayan from the Dou family. My mother is Princess Xiangyang." Shunqiao finally understood. "Ah, so your uncle should be the previous emperor?" Dou Yan nodded. My home is being monitored. Those people wanted to enter the palace and meet His Majesty, so I had to secretly run away. At first, I planned to come here and look for Uncle Bian, but I didn't find anyone. And there are people looking for me outside, so I'm too scared to leave." Shunqiao frowned. "What is going on? Your mother is the previous emperor's older sister and the current emperor's aunt. Who would dare to make things difficult for you?" Just as he said these words, he realized, other than the emperor, who dared to make things difficult for them? So it had to be the emperor, didn't it? Dou Yan bit her lip as if she found it hard to talk about. Shun Chao decided not to keep pressing her for answers. Instead, he said gently, I'm afraid the people here have long left already. It's pointless to stay here waiting for them. Why don't you head home first? With your mother there, surely His Majesty wouldn't dare do anything. No, I can't go home. Doyen repeatedly shook her head. If I go home, His Majesty will summon me to the palace, and Mother and Father won't be able to stop him. My life will be in danger. Hearing the seriousness of the situation from her words, Shun Chao was also temporarily at a loss. He was about to ask her about her plans now when a loud burst of noise came from outside. Footsteps soon followed, coming in their direction. Then, right after, there was the sound of the manor's gates being forcefully shoved open. This isn't an important location. Its residences have probably already left. There's no need for you lot to come in. I can go in and check by myself. The voice saying these words was somewhat familiar, and after Shun Chao thought hard for a while, he recalled a person. Pu Liu Ru Jian. Alarmed, Doyen hid behind him and tugged at his sleeve. Let's go! Hurry, let's go! When she saw that Shun Chao didn't move, she paused her steps, then directly ran back into the first building. She'd probably gone to hide beneath that bed again. Doyen had just run inside when Pu Liu Rujian strode over and had just happened to come face to face with Shun Chao, still in the courtyard. Shun Chao's expression was placid. Instead, it was Pu Liu Rujian who was stunned at the sight of him. You... He'd just managed to say that one word when he immediately shut his mouth again. He sent a glance outside, then gestured at Shun Chao, signaling at him to stay quiet. Shun Chao understood the hint and nodded his head, waiting for Pu Liu Rujian to speak first. Pu Liu Rujian's eyebrows knitted tighter and tighter as various expressions flickered over his face. It seemed like he was hesitating over what to say. Instead, it was Doyen who moved first. When she heard no further sounds from within the building, she couldn't help but tiptoe out, plastering herself against the wall to peek outside. But though she thought she was being sneaky, Pu Liu Rujian noticed her. Surprise came over his face and he walked forward. Doyen was so frightened she almost ran back inside. Does Taoist Master Shun know where Bian Dafu has gone? He put all his effort into keeping his voice as low as possible, but he spoke at a rapid-fire pace. Of course, Shun Chao shook his head. I have received a request that I am unable to fulfill at present, said Pu Liu Rujian. So, I can only trouble Taoist Master Shun to lend me a hand. Please help me escort the Dou family's young lady to the Su family for refuge. Su family? Shun Chao's face betrayed his puzzlement. The Duke of Meian County's residence. Right at this moment, a loud voice came from outside. Dare this one ask if the Duke of Sui has found anything? Does he require this lowly one's assistance? Pu Liu Rujian quickly replied in a loud voice. No need. I'm coming out. He was unable to explain further and could only cup his hands at Shun Chao before turning and leaving in a hurry. The faint sounds of conversation came from the gates. After a moment, the entire group left and the gates were closed and locked once more. Doyen poked her head out of the building, her expression anxious. Shun Chao said to her, Everyone's left. The Duke of Sui asked me to bring you to the residence of the Duke of Meian County first, to take refuge there. What do you think? Doyen thought for a while. That will do. The Duke of Meian County has always been on good terms with Father. Father should have made the request. Then I must trouble Taoist Master Shun. Will this be a burden on you? Shun Chao smiled. No, not at all. It is no harder than lifting a finger. He picked up Doyen, lightly vaulted over the wall, and followed her directions, taking the side roads to the Su residence. Doyen had never seen such perfected Qinggong before, and she spent the entire journey gaping in astonishment. By the time they arrived at the Su residence's back gates, her gaze toward Shun Chao was filled with awe and reverence. Shun Chao couldn't help but stroke her head with its double buns. Then he entered the Su residence by once again vaulting over the wall by the back gates. Doyen whispered the directions to him. After we pass this courtyard, the second building ahead of us is the study. I've gone there with Father before. The Duke of Meian County is usually there during the daytime. With Shun Chao's abilities, infiltrating the Su residence was a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Su Wei was perfectly at peace, reading in his study when two figures, one large and one small, suddenly shoved the doors open and entered. Caught off guard, he almost yelled in shock. Fortunately, he did recognize Shun Chao and Do Yan, and he forced down the words he'd been about to blurt out before switching to a more normal tone. Ah, Taoist Master Shun? Doar Nyang? Do Yan slid down from Shun Chao's arms and said crisply, Uncle, please don't be alarmed. Ah Yan didn't come here with any ill intentions. Su Wei quickly rose and opened the door, peering inside. When he'd determined that no one was eavesdropping, he closed it again, then asked behind him, Why did you come here, Ah Yan? I heard that the Do residence has been surrounded by His Majesty's people. They're looking for you. Do Yan spoke downcast. Yes, it's my fault. I brought so much trouble to my parents. His Majesty fears that my parents have hidden me away, so now he's currently keeping a close eye on my family. I can't return for now. I can only come and plead for Uncle to protect me. I met the Duke of Sui at the Bien residence, Shun Chao said. He was the one who asked us to come find Duke Su. Su Wei sighed. Very well. Come with me. He didn't ask for more details. He must have already known about the situation beforehand. Instead, it was Shun Chao who felt like everything had been outside of his expectations since he'd entered Chang'an. All he could do now was take things as they came. Su Wei stood to push aside a bookshelf, revealing the secret entrance hidden behind it. Then he led them through a door and through a hidden passage until they finally arrived in another building. This building wasn't dark. Sunlight could enter through the windows, which were shaded on the outside by a tree. The rays filtered faintly through the leaves and into the building. If it were summer, the building would be an excellent place to spend a vacation in. But in the same way, its location was well concealed and difficult to discover. Next to the window stood a man, facing away from them with his arms behind his back. When Su Wei pushed the door open to enter, the man turned around and saw Do Yan. He couldn't help his astonishment. Arnyang? Do Yan's behavior the entire trip had been rather precocious, but when she saw this man, she couldn't stop herself from wailing. Fifth uncle! My uncle, the previous emperor, was killed by my cousin. All three men's faces paled with shock. Well, everyone. We have finished the chapters 80, 81, and 82, and things are not looking too good. Emperor Yuanyong is dead, and clearly his own son sucks ass. I don't really have anything to say. We're just going to go to the next video, which is going to be the final 3 chapters, and I will see you all there.